This is 10 minutes after midnight with Pastor Stewart, Waterhouse. Today's topic is the Ark of the Covenant. The CIA claims to have found the Ark, so we'll examine the CIA's claims. We'll examine the implications of that. Does the Ark bring great power to those who possess it? Does it represent the personal presence of God? I think one thing we should do is to read a verse out of the Bible. But first, the Jews have made plans to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. This would be the third temple. They have all the furnishings put together. Each stone to build the temple has already been found, and exactly how it's going to fit together with a number on each stone so that it can be quickly built. But they don't own the temple site. It's on the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and it's owned by Jordan. So that's holding up the Jewish third temple. How important is this Jewish third temple? What is its implications? This is what we're going to examine today. President Trump went over to Israel, and he's been a great supporter of Israel and modern Israel, because I want to distinguish between Judah and Israel, because modern Israel is actually Judah. It's not Israel. There were two kingdoms in the Old Testament. They're very distinctly different. We'll get into that. But Trump went over there and he borrowed some of the furnishings that belong or will belong into the third temple, including the Jews had built an exact replica of the Ark of the Covenant, and Trump took that replica made with real gold, and it's all sitting in Mar-a-Lago right now. In a way, Trump is the modern Nebuchadnezzar, as the U.S. is the modern Babylon, and he's looted the third temple before it's even built. Well, he may give it back. I think he's just ensuring his place in history, that when they build it, they have to include him, because he now has the most important item intended for that's the Ark of the Covenant. Let's read here from Matthew chapter 23 verse 38. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till you shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." Now what does that mean? Their house is left to them desolate, their temple. Jesus spoke of this just before his crucifixion. He was speaking to the Pharisees, he was speaking to the Jews, and he said, your house is desolate. God is no longer there. He's no longer in the temple, it's desolate. God is no longer in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is desolate. God is no longer with the Jews are desolate. They don't have God. They are desolate until such time that they welcome Jesus back and say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. That would be Jesus, because Jesus is our Lord and Savior. They haven't done that yet. Their religion is desolate, their temple is desolate, God's presence is not there. And so Trump took the Ark of the Covenant, is sitting in Mar-a-Lago. Some social media influencers had dinner with Trump, and Trump took them aside and said, look what I have. Fascinating, yeah? If the Jewish religion is desolate, then Jesus is not found there. So if your preacher says, bless modern Israel, or stand with the Jews, or these are God's chosen people, then your preacher is perpetuating a fraud, because it's desolate. Any Zionist preacher out there, today is your choice. You have to make a choice between serving Jesus and being a real Christian, or being a stooge of the Pharisees. Welcome. This is Pastor Stewart, Waterhouse, with 10 minutes after midnight. And today we'll be talking about the Ark of the Covenant. The CIA has recently released documents that the CIA believes they know where the Ark of the Covenant is at. And of course, you see my background here, my goats. I'm a goat herder. Isn't that right? Meet Gracie. Yeah, Gracie's a good one, as is Buddy. And Daffy. Hello, Daffy. Daffy's a nice one. Hey, you meet some of my animals. Let me see if I can pull up the document for you so you can see what we're talking about. This is the document here. I don't know if you can see it on my cell phone. It's Project Sunstreak, and it's remote viewing. Previously, the CIA, through whatever intelligence, discovered what they believed was the location of the Ark of the Covenant. And today we'll get into its locations throughout history. It started with the CIA in 1981. Of course, we had the movie come out, Raiders of the Lost Ark. At that time, Ronald Reagan was president, and Nancy Reagan was interested in the movie. In 1982, Ron Wyatt, amateur archaeologist, he went over and believed he had discovered the Ark of the Covenant. I met with him in, late 1982, sometime soon after he claimed to have discovered it. His theory was quite literalistic. He believes that when Jesus died, the blood of Jesus would have to actually touch the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant to procure the atonement. I believe that it's all symbolic. In any case, he was very literalistic. So he discovered on Golgotha, the hill where Jesus was crucified, what he believed was 3 holes in the ground where 3 crosses were put. Probably the same hole was used over and over. He pushed a rock aside and saw that the hole went on down in. So he thought maybe the Ark of the Covenant is hidden in a cave underneath the cross, and then the blood could, when Jesus was pierced on his side, drip down the cave and drip onto the mercy seat, and therefore the atonement would be complete. That was his theory. And so he explored and found a cave. He squeezed around and wiggled through this cave, as he described it to me. He came to a room which he believed was underneath where the cross was. In this room, he thought he saw the Ark of the Covenant. I asked him what it looked like. He couldn't exactly tell me, but he said the glory of the place overtook him, and he passed out and went unconscious for at least 20 minutes. When he came to, he realized he better just back out, and he didn't go back in. That was his discovery, as he told me. The CIA picked up interest, perhaps sanctioned by Reagan, maybe not. At least Reagan's wife was interested. The CIA did a remote viewing program to view a site they didn't have access to. The remote viewer would be given coordinates, and then of whatever it was they needed to remote view, maybe a Soviet military base, whatever, and then the remote viewer would be able to, through clairvoyance, visit the site and then describe it back to the CIA agent that was taking notes. And I do believe this document of the CIA is genuine. It is genuine, but I believe it's also real because it was a double blind. The viewer was not told what was at that location. He was only given the location, and then he had to describe it. And of course, his description very much matches the Ark of the Covenant. He talks about a coffin-shaped container box covered with gold. He describes the angels with the wings outstretched on top of the container, which is the Ark of the Covenant. That's what the CIA wanted him to view, but they didn't tell him he was going to view the Ark of the Covenant. So he probably was actually viewing the location. Now, unfortunately, in the CIA document release, it does give the coordinates, but the CIA covered it up. Now, we know they're not going to totally release, right? So apparently, they're given false coordinates in the document that was released, because those coordinates, when I checked, are in the middle of the ocean, somewhere up in the Arctic. It did leave out the south, north, the east, west, so it could be somewhere else. We don't know. It does give us a lot of information. It tells us that it was in a underground area, damp. Of course, a cave would be damp. It tells us that it was guarded by entities and a power, and we can speculate what kind of power the Ark of the Covenant had. Some people think that, you remember, Uzzah reached out and touched it and he died because it was about to fall off the ox cart and he wanted to stabilize it. But does the Ark, is designed with gold overlaid on wood, create a static electricity charge that's capable of holding enough to kill somebody that touches it? Because the command was you don't touch it, only the Levites could, and they used poles that were through rings on the Ark. The other thing it speaks of in the CIA document about its location is it was in an area with a lot of domes, buildings that had dome tops. It was Arabic speaking. So it describes this cave would be in a mosque or under a mosque. That's the type of information in this release CIA document. Let's get into the history of the Ark of the Covenant. When Moses went up to Sinai, God gave him the law, right? And then God wrote the law in 2 tables of stone with his own finger. The Ark of the Covenant contains the law. The law was put inside there. It also contains the jar of manna that they were fed under Exodus, and it contains Aaron's rod that budded. And we'll get into that a little bit later because that's very important to its location. It was made as a pattern after the true ark, which is in heaven. So these things in the earthly sanctuary were a copy. And Leviticus is very specific about how it's made and all the rituals surrounding it. And once a year was the Day of Atonement, when the congregation of God's chosen would be forgiven of all their transactions and sins. Atonement would be made, and a sacrifice would take place. Of course, there was a daily sacrifice too, which took place in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, but not the immediate presence. It was in the outer part of the sanctuary. The Ark rested in the Holy of Holies, called the Holy Place, in the inner sanctum. But once a year, the high priest would take blood from a sacrifice, in this case a goat, and sprinkle that blood on the mercy seat, and because there's no remission without blood. In Leviticus, when God laid out the rituals surrounding the Ark of the Covenant, they were forbidden from having sacrifice, the religious rituals, outside of the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. The sacrifice had to be performed at the tabernacle, which contained the Ark. Couldn't do the sacrifice elsewhere. And I think that's very important too, because that's the center of the religion. Let's go clear back to who owns the Ark of the Covenant, who is the rightful people. Because there's always an argument, right? And according to CIA viewing, it's in Arabic-speaking hands, or at least hidden under a temple that would be Arabic, like a mosque. There was contention in Israel as to who should be custodian of the Ark of the Covenant. A test was performed. Every tribe took their staff that was symbolic of their tribe. It had the tribe's name inscribed on the staff, and brought it together and was put in the sanctuary overnight. And whichever one budded, that is the tribe that would have custody of the Ark. Aaron's rod budded. That meant the Levites had custody. Not the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Dan, not any other tribe. It was the Levites, which is, of course, what God says in the book of Leviticus. There was contention, and so this settled the matter. And then Aaron's rod is put inside the Ark of the Covenant with the Ten Commandments as an everlasting reminder that it was the tribe of Levite. When they entered the Promised Land, every tribe, because there was 12 tribes that descended of Isaac, every tribe was given an inheritance, an area of the land that belonged to that tribe. Judah was given the area that belonged to Judea. Benjamin was next to Judah, and then the other 10 tribes above that. Now, as whoever controls religion controls the politics too, right? Because religion is a powerful force. That's why the matter was settled with the Aaron's rod that budded. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Solomon built a temple, right? For the Ark to rest in. And Solomon also had an affair with the Queen of Sheba, I guess. She came to visit him. And so there's some people who believe that produced a son, Menelik the first. Now the Bible doesn't mention Menelik. It's traditions from the Queen of Sheba's side that mention it. Queen of Sheba, of course, was the queen in Yemen. And Yemen territory extended into part of Ethiopia. And their story is that the son stole the Ark of the Covenant, took it back to Ethiopia. It moved around Ethiopia a couple places, perhaps even made it into Yemen, I don't know. And currently, they believe that the Ark is in a little church in Ethiopia called Our Lady Mary of Zion. And nobody's allowed to go in there except for the caretaker, which is only one person, to tend to the Ark. When the caretaker dies, they appoint a new caretaker. That caretaker is not allowed to leave that church. Nobody's allowed to go in it, at least not to where the Ark is kept. So who knows? I don't believe that's the case. It doesn't fit the biblical narrative. The Bible mentions after Solomon, Isaiah commanded that the Ark be put into the temple permanently and not moved around anymore. You back up a little bit, and that's after Solomon was long gone. So the Ark was still somewhere in the hands of the Levites at that point in Israel, or Judah, or both. Every tribe had their allotted portion of land except Levite. Levite was given 48 different cities. You can find that in the Bible and read where those cities are, spread throughout all the tribes, because they were going to be the priest and administer the sacrifices and the other religious rituals for every tribe. And the Ark of the Covenant was in a tabernacle. Some simplify it and think the tabernacle was only during the Exodus period when they were wandering through the desert. That was God's intention, to have the tabernacle go to the different tribes. That's why the Levites were spread out in every tribe of Israel, so that they could administer the priestly rites to every tribe. That's why there's 48 different cities spread out. And that was the practice up until Josiah. Josiah was considered a good king, and of course he'd have a good argument that maybe the Ark should have a permanent home, and what better, it's one that Judah controls, right? Although, believe it or not, Jerusalem belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. Judah pretty much occupied Benjamin, bullied Benjamin, and basically stole Jerusalem from Benjamin. And of course David made Jerusalem his home. David was king, united all Israel with Judah to be king. Before that, it was just every man do what right in his own sight. But basically what we had was a decentralized religion, because the Ark of the Covenant would travel around. If anybody did a sacrifice outside of the tabernacle, away from the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, they were cut off. They were disfellowshipped. They lost their citizenship. They were totally cut off from the camp. So Judah would like to have the ark because that would make everybody have to come to them. It would be great political power. And so Josiah, the king of Judah, Josiah was not king of Israel, he was king of Judah. There were two kingdoms. The kingdom to the north was Israel. The kingdom to the south was Judah. Benjamin was considered part of the kingdom of Judah because Judah occupied Benjamin. Although the Apostle Paul lays the tribe of Benjamin under Israel as part of the kingdom of Israel. But the point I'm making here is that when the Bible speaks of Israel, it's not speaking of the Jews. It's not speaking of Judah. It is speaking of the 10 or 11 other tribes. When this Bible prophesies about Judah, it states Judah. And that's why a lot of times the prophecies say Israel and Judah, because the prophecy applied to both. Both were descendants of Isaac, right? And both were God's chosen people. And so the Bible very much distinguishes between Israel and Judah, and today we think the terms are synonymous. No, they're not. They each had their own kings. They each had their own prophets. Some prophets like Jeremiah prophesied about both. Jeremiah was a Levite. Although Jeremiah mostly prophesied about Judah because he was talking about the Babylonian captivity to come. Josiah asked that the ark be kept in the temple Solomon built. Now, we know that Josiah's wish wasn't fully honored by the Levites because Jeremiah, a very important prophet, still took and carried the ark around. And we read that in the second book of Maccabees. Maccabees is a great historical book. As Protestants, we don't believe it was an inspired book, but that doesn't negate the historical value. Jeremiah carried around the ark. According to the book of Maccabees, Jeremiah even took the ark and the furnishings, the tent, and so forth, as far as the Mount Nebo in Jordan, which is where Moses viewed the promised land, if you remember that story. And then it says in Maccabees that Jeremiah hid the ark in a cave and sealed it up. Now, you got to understand the book of Maccabees, that doesn't mean that the cave is on Mount Nebo. If you didn't understand that Maccabees is a summary where they took text that was written beforehand and they picked a verse here and a verse here. In other words, they were getting all the highlights, putting it together as a summary. One of the highlights would have been that Jeremiah took the ark and visited Mount Nebo. Another highlight is that in the very next verse in Maccabees that he buried it in a cave. But you see, that's a compression of the various writings about Jeremiah regarding the ark. So the cave could have been anywhere. Doesn't have to be Mount Nebo. It just says he buried it in a cave. Now, why would Jeremiah do that? Some say because he knew the Babylonian captivity was going to take place. Probably not why, because as we see, Josiah wanted the ark so that the Jews would have control of the ark. Jeremiah stopped that by taking the ark because Jeremiah was a Levite, and he believed that it should be carried around like a circuit preacher, a circuit priest, to administer to everybody. So to prevent that from being permanently put there in the temple, Jeremiah hid it in the cave and sealed it up, basically contradicting the wishes of Josiah. Of course, when Jeremiah did this, Josiah was no longer king. There were several kings after Josiah, and Jeremiah was still alive. When the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar came, that would have been 40 years after Josiah had asked for it to be kept in the temple. And it was actually even 10 years after that before Nebuchadnezzar raided the temple and took the gold and furnishings back to Babylon. It's in Kings 25:13, where the Bible describes the various furnishings and gold that Nebuchadnezzar stole from the temple. In that description, the ark is not listed. The Babylonians kept records, and there was no record describing anything that would resemble the ark. So the Babylonians did not take the ark and melt it down for the gold or anything like that. Jeremiah, according to Maccabees, had already previously put it in a cave so that the tribe of Judah couldn't dominate it. When Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, he did not take Jeremiah prisoner, and Jeremiah did not go into captivity with others because Jeremiah's prophecies were favorable to Nebuchadnezzar, so he had nothing against Jeremiah. Later, however, some of Jeremiah's friends kidnapped Jeremiah, took him to Egypt because they were afraid maybe the Babylonians would take him into captivity. So he was, against his will, fled to Egypt, where Jeremiah disappears from history in Egypt. Perhaps he took the ark there, probably not, because he'd already buried it in a cave. Some believe he took the ark to Egypt, and from Egypt Jeremiah went to Ireland, and in Ireland he buried it in a cave there in a hill called Tara. But they made some archaeological expeditions, dug up that whole hill, and they didn't find the ark. Now back to the CIA. So it's in a cave somewhere. The CIA thinks they have intelligence and want to know. So they do remote viewing. It's controlled by Arabic speaking in a cave under a mosque that has domes, apparently not just one dome, but other dome buildings around it. When the Jews came back from Babylonian captivity, they built the second temple. Jeremiah didn't leave any information as to what cave he had put the ark. So the second temple didn't contain the ark. It was built in the same place as Solomon's temple, which Nebuchadnezzar destroyed. But the second temple basically was a fraud. It didn't contain the ark. It had the holy place for it. And in the holy place was the foundation stone. In the first temple, the ark was most likely placed on the foundation stone. It didn't have its own pedestal. So apparently used the rock, placed it on it in the holy place. The high priest, during the second temple period, after the return from the Babylonian captivity, and they had rebuilt a temple, went into the Holy of Holies once a year to sprinkle the blood, but there was no ark, was a mercy seat. God's presence wasn't there. And they just sprinkled it on the foundation stone. So I would say the second temple period, which was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, was all a fraud. And of course, they even tricked a lot of Levites into thinking that Jerusalem should be the center of worship, when God's original plan was a tabernacle tent which could be moved around to 48 different cities. It was a decentralized religion versus a centralized religion. But the Jews had a fraud because the second temple never contained the ark. So who does currently have the ark, according to the CIA? Actually, who does the ark belong to? Here's some interesting things. Who is the true race descended from Adam? A lot of interesting stuff here, but we have to look into all that. The Levant, which we know as Israel, which we know as Palestine, although the borders aren't exactly the same. The Levant was a little bit bigger, and Greater Israel was a little bit bigger than what you see it today. But nonetheless, the pure races from Adam, I would say it would have to be the black races in Africa, because science, genealogy show that they have no Neanderthal DNA. So their race is pure. They didn't interbreed with the Neanderthals. Who did Cain marry when he left? After he killed his brother, he had to leave the family home, right? There must have been somebody out there he interbred with, probably the Neanderthal. I don't know. There obviously were other types of humans that God had created that were somehow dwelling on the earth. So there are Neanderthal ruins in Palestine. You can dig up the bones of the Neanderthals, which is like prehistory, right? But the Neanderthals did live in the Levant, in Israel area, in Palestine area, in Canaan. Canaan would be a better way of describing it. But they didn't live in Africa, so the Africans never interbred. During one migration out of Africa, they did interbreed with Neanderthals. In fact, the white gene was a Neanderthal DNA gene. So white people got their whiteness from the Neanderthals. The Levant was no different. There was Neanderthals there, so the Canaanites would have interbred with the Neanderthals and carry some Neanderthal DNA. Now this is interesting because the Arabs from Arabia, Saudi Arabia, they're a pure race too, just like the Africans. They have no Neanderthal DNA. As far as I know, they're the only two pure races, is the Arabs and the Africans. All other races have Neanderthal DNA, including the Palestinians. And I bring this up because it's important to note that the Palestinians are not Arab. Arabs have no Neanderthal DNA, the Palestinians do. Palestinians are indigenous to Canaan, to ancient Israel. During the Arab conquest, the Arab language was imported, but the indigenous people still were the indigenous people. They're not Arab. They adopted the Arab language because the Arabs were control, and with commerce you would have to then speak Arabic because of trade, so the people learned Arabic that lived there. And then when the Arabs left, which was more recently, then Arabic is still spoken. And apparently they adopted Islam too. Now this leads me up to another important statement, because I'm going to say that the Palestinians are the descendants of Israel and Canaanites. They intermarried. Even Judah intermarried. Think about it. Judah himself, the founder of the tribe of Judah, married a Canaanite woman. It's in the Bible. So the whole tribe of Judah was half Canaanite. But the other tribes also intermarried were probably even more Canaanite than Judah. So the argument can be made by some people, and I don't agree with the argument. I'm going to state it in order to refute it, that, well, the Israelites, the Palestinians, adopted Islam and didn't stay true to the Hebrew religion, and therefore they're no longer God's chosen because they didn't stay true. Whereas Judah preserves the religion, and we have the Jews today with the religion still from the Old Testament of the Bible, and therefore it's still God's chosen. The Jews are no more biblical in their religion than is, for example, Islam. Because, for example, how can you have a spiritual teacher called a rabbi from the tribe of Judah? The Bible was very clear, and even Aaron's rod that budded made it doubly clear that it was supposed to be the Levites that were the spiritual teachers, not a Judah rabbi. It's not in the Bible. It's contrary to the Bible, see? Their whole religion may flow from it originally. Christianity does, Islam and so forth, but it's not the same as the religion in the Bible. It's mostly based on Jewish tradition from the Talmud. So that argument doesn't hold up because they have abandoned the real teaching. After Jesus died, the angel showed it as a fraud by tearing the curtain in two that separated the holy place from the rest of the sanctuary so that they could view into the holies and see there was no Ark of Covenant there, that the whole temple service was a fraud. So that argument doesn't hold up. Biologically was very important in the Bible. Biologically, the Palestinians are descendants of the children of Israel. Even if they have adopted Islam, even if they have adopted the Arabic language, they're not Arab. Now, the Jews, are they actually from the tribe of Judah? They're not either. Most of them were converted to the Jewish religion, Judaism. But I'm not going to impinge their religion. If they converted to Judaism, they're Jews, right? By religion, maybe not by DNA, but by religion they are. Jesus was not a Jew by DNA because Joseph was a Jew, but Joseph was Jesus' legal father. Therefore, Jesus could be considered a Jew. That's why he told the woman that salvation is of the Jews, because salvation is of Jesus and he's of the Jews. But fact is, Jesus was probably from the tribe of Levite, which would be from his mom Mary, because Mary's cousin was a priest, a Levite priest. The Bible tells us that. So while the Bible may not tell us what tribe Mary is from, the best evidence is that her cousin was a Levite, so Mary was probably a Levite. DNA-wise, Jesus only got his DNA from Mary because his father was from the Holy Spirit, so Jesus would have been a Levite, not a Jew. In fact, Jesus grew up in Galilee. Galilee is not in Judea. Nonetheless, Jesus' father, Joseph, was a Jew. Therefore, Jesus could claim to be a descendant of David, legally, through adoption. Jesus' priestly ministry, the covenant and the sanctuary service, taught us about God's redemption. It's about the spilling of blood for the remission of sins, purification, how God gave his mercy. Jesus was God's son and loved us so much to come, even unto the point of death, that God has to value us for the sake of Jesus. And so when Jesus' blood appealed and spoke to God's presence, that's what the animal sacrifice symbolized, it showed that our sins are truly forgiven. Jesus loved us to the point of death, and God honored that, resurrected Jesus, which means also then he will resurrect us, because that's the covenant between us and Jesus. God, the covenant with the Father. The true ark, whether it's symbolic or a physical thing, is up in heaven. We see that in the book of Revelation. But where is the original ark? The CIA claims to know where it is. And who really owns it? We've already established the Jews shouldn't own it. The Levites do. And that all Israel has equal access to it, not just the Jews. The Jews wanted to have the temple and keep the ark there, and even Jeremiah, a very renowned prophet, didn't go along with that. Now, the foundation stone on the Temple Mount, which is the Dome of the Rock, where Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. The mosque compound includes the Dome of the Rock. That's built over the foundation stone, which is where the Jews believe the Holy of Holies was. And then, of course, there's some other dome buildings, too. That one of them's named after the Ten Commandments there in the complex. These are all owned by Jordan and administered by the Hashemite kingdom. It's not owned by Israel. Israel may control checkpoints of people going in and out, but it's under Arab control or Palestinian control. Palestinians worship there, not the Jews, even though the Jews believe that was the site of their temple. But their whole temple, second temple period, was a fraud. It didn't contain the Ark of the Covenant, at least not accessible to the priests that officiated there. Under the foundation stone, there is a cave. I found that to be the case in many holy sites. There would be a cave, the underworld, a place for the spirits. When this is about 600 years after Christ, when the Arabs invaded the Holy Land, the Arabs built steps going into it out of marble, and because it was a very sacred place. This foundation rock is a lot to do with the Prophet Muhammad, a lot to do with the creation of the earth. It's even where perhaps Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac, according to some stories. So it's a very holy site, and especially to Muslims, Islam. And so the Arab conquest, they built marble steps going down into this cave, and they built a marble floor. However, if you look at the floor closely, you'll see one area there's a depression in the floor, and when you knock on that depression, you can hear a hollow space underneath it. In other words, there's more cave underneath it. There's another chamber below, or more chambers. And when they built the floor, they probably just built it over a floor that was already built. They just wanted to upgrade it and make it nice and marble, which they did. But the floor that would have been there previously could have been sealed off, could have been done by Jeremiah. That could be where the ark is. A great place to hide something is under the nose of the people you're trying to keep hidden from. And according to 2 Maccabees, they wanted to find that cave later, and Jeremiah scolded his followers and said, no, we don't want to keep a record of where we hid it, because then they might find it. Jeremiah didn't want Judah to dominate, because he was a Levite, and his responsibility was all of Israel. Even today, if the Palestinians, which I believe firmly they are the house of Israel, then they have an equal right to the Ark of the Covenant and to the holy site. And in fact, more of a right than does the Jews, because the Jews is Judah. And Jerusalem is actually, while the Jews claim it, it actually belonged to Benjamin, which the Apostle Paul talks about. Paul says he's an Israelite because he's of the tribe of Benjamin, right? So Paul throws Benjamin in with the Israelites, even though Judah dominated them because they were a border tribe. Paul also says he was a Jew because he came from the Jewish culture. He was dominated by the Jews. Benjamin was dominated, and so Paul came out of the Jewish religion. So he claimed to be both a Jew and an Israelite. And this is where a lot of the confusion today, I think, comes from, that the Jew and Israel are the same when they're very different. They had different kings, different prophets. They're not the same. And the Palestinians are Israel, not Judah. See, Judah is trying to steal all of Israel's land. Judah was given an inheritance in Judea. That's it. The rest of the land belongs to Israel, which are the Palestinians. The Palestinians came from the rest of Israel. And yeah, they Canaanite too, because they all intermarried. Both tribes did. All of Israel married and married, as did Judah. I think that the CIA didn't have access to find the ark there, but it's in that cave, below the floor of that cave, in another chamber, which has been sealed probably since the time of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah put the Ark of the Covenant in there. That cave is called the Well of Souls because that's where the souls of the deceased are waiting the final judgment, the resurrection. So there you have it about the Ark of the Covenant. And you understand the wars where Judah is slaughtering the Palestinians because they envy their brethren to the north. They covet their land, they covet their religion, they covet their historical right and possessions. But God has seen to it that the Temple Mount, which is the Dome of the Rock, is firmly still